Hello and welcome to my video, which is aimed at complete knitting beginners. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you step by step how to knit a scarf from scratch. I'll teach you how to cast on and bind off, how to do knit stitches and slip stitches, how to add tassels, and a few more tips along the way. This video looks a bit different to my other videos and is in a longer format, and that's because it was a Skillshare class, but I've decided to bring all my classes over to YouTube. So I hope you enjoy this video, and thank you very much for watching. One of the best things about knitting is the low barrier to entry and how cheap it is to get started. Because after all, you only need a few basic things. All you'll need for this knitting project is a pair of needles, a couple of balls of yarn, a tapestry or yarn needle, and some scissors. And also a scrap bit of thread wouldn't go amiss. I would definitely recommend using a bulkier weight of yarn, such as chunky or super chunky, because that way the scarf just knits up quicker. A scarf made of super chunky yarn consists of less stitches than a scarf the same size made from double knit yarn, for instance. So I would definitely recommend that as a beginner you should use chunky or super chunky yarn. I ended up using about 1 1/4 balls of yarn, so about 125 grams of chunky yarn. If we just take a quick look at the yarn label, you'll see that it gives you all the washing instructions, and then underneath that there is a picture of some needles. That gives you the recommended needle size that you should use with this particular yarn. So in this case, I'm going to be using 6mm needles, which is the equivalent of US size 10. The little grid to the right of that you don't need to worry about, so don't let that confuse you. That's more important if you're making something that has to fit accurately, for instance, a jumper. Underneath that, it tells you the material that the yarn is made from. If it's a budget yarn, it's very likely to be 100% acrylic, which makes it easy to wash. The more money you spend on the yarn, the more wool content there probably will be. And underneath that, it tells you how many yards and meters you get in a single 100-gram ball. A bit further down, it tells you the shade, which is denim. And then on the other side is a number which represents the dye lot. All balls of yarn that have the same dye lot number on the yarn label were dyed at the same time in the same dye. What this means is that all the yarn that has the same dye lot number will be exactly the same shade. What you'll find is that there is a lot more variation in smaller batches of yarn, particularly handmade yarns or yarns made by small businesses. In terms of this type of yarn, it's a budget yarn and it would have been dyed with a lot of other yarn, so it's a lot less of an issue. However, you do want to try and find balls of yarn that have the same dye lot number, just to be on the safe side. And these are the needles I'm going to be using, and they're made from wood. And you can see that there's a cable connecting the two needles together. If you're a beginner to the world of knitting, you may never have seen circular knitting needles before. And that's what these are. They're circular knitting needles and they allow you to knit in the round. Now, I don't want you to worry at all about what that means, because that is a lesson far in the future. All you need to know is that they do exactly the same job as straight needles, which are probably the needles that you've seen people most often knitting with. So please don't let the cable confuse you. It's just that circular knitting needles can be used for almost any knitting project, and that's why I use them for pretty much everything, because they're so versatile. So it's completely up to you what you want to buy for this project, either circular knitting needles or straight knitting needles. Usually the straight needles are cheaper and easier to come by, so those are probably the best choice for a beginner. Adding stitches onto the needle is the very first stage of any knitted project, and it's called casting on. We're going to be using a method that's called the long tail cast on, which is very popular and versatile. It's the one I pretty much use all the time. The reason it's called a long tail cast on is because you need to leave a long tail of yarn to start with. So that's what we're going to do first. We're going to take the end of the yarn, and for every 10 stitches we want to put onto the needles, we're going to need a tail of about 12 inches. So that's 12 inches of yarn to make 10 stitches, which is quite a generous amount of yarn, but it means you won't run out. I'm personally going to be casting on 20 stitches, but the number of stitches you cast on is entirely up to you. Using 20 stitches in chunky yarn, like I am, creates a scarf that's about 5 inches wide. If you want a scarf that's narrower than that, then you can use less stitches, and if you want a scarf that's wider than that, you can increase the number of stitches, or you can use a super chunky yarn rather than just a chunky yarn. Okay, so because I'm casting on 20 stitches, I need about 24 inches of yarn tail. So I'm going to do a slip knot about 24 inches from the end of the yarn. If you don't know how to do a slip knot, you basically just pick up the yarn, twist it into a loop, and then bring your index finger and thumb through the loop, grab onto the tail of yarn, and pull it back through that loop. And that should produce a loop that you can then easily pull apart, like so. So pick up the yarn and twist, and then pull through a loop of the yarn tail and tighten. You're then going to take one of your knitting needles and lower the slip knot over it. Make sure when you do this that the tail of yarn is at the front towards you, and the working yarn, which is the yarn that's connected to the ball of yarn, is at the back. So tail towards you and working yarn towards the back. And then tighten the slip knot. This slip knot counts as the very first stitch. Once we've done that, we're going to cast on the other 19 stitches. So the next step is to take your left hand and use the bottom 3 fingers. You simply pick up the working yarn and the tail together using these 3 fingers. You then grip onto those 2 pieces of yarn. The yarn needs to be able to move through these fingers, but you don't want it to be loose. So you move your left hand far enough away from the needle to allow you to take your index finger and thumb in between those pieces of yarn. And you then move your index finger and thumb outwards and upwards to produce a kind of slingshot pose. This is the pose that you need to do in order to cast on. Don't worry if this feels awkward or confusing. Once you get the hang of it, it will become very simple, I promise. During this, you'll be holding the needle with your right hand. So now we're going to repeat a short sequence of steps for each of the 19 stitches we want to cast on. During this process, you're going to direct the point of the needle with your right hand, and preferably using your index finger to give you more control. You first move the point of the knitting needle towards you and go under the piece of yarn right at the front, just in front of your thumb. And then you go over, down and under the yarn in front of your index finger and up. And then you take your knitting needle point down through the loop that's around your thumb. And then you release that loop around your thumb and use your now free thumb to tighten the yarn. And that creates 1 stitch on your needle. I know that this seems complicated to start with, but please stick with it. It's only a few steps, but it does take a few goes to get it into your memory. So we'll do that again. You take the knitting needle point down and under the yarn in front of your thumb and up, then over, down and under the yarn in front of your index finger and up, and then down through the loop around your thumb and up. And just as you've done that, you release the loop around your thumb and use your thumb to tighten the yarn just by pushing sideways against it. And now we have 3 stitches. Okay, so again, take the yarns in your 3 fingers and grip. Take your index finger and thumb down, up and around. And then take the needle to the front, under and up, over, down and under the yarn in front of your finger, and up, and then down through the loop on your thumb, which you then release and then tighten. So now I'll cast on the rest of the stitches, and I'll go quicker and quicker to show you just how efficient this technique really is. It might seem awkward and difficult to start with, but once you've learnt this method, then this can be used for almost all knitting projects, so it's really worth sticking with. It's an efficient way of adding stitches to your needles, and it produces a nice neat edge. Okay, so that's all 20 stitches now on one needle. And the next step is just to start knitting, which I'll be moving on to in the next lesson. Now the knit stitch is of course extremely important in knitting and is the basic building block of any knitting project. This scarf is going to be made up almost entirely of knit stitches, so at the end you're going to be a bit of an expert. Essentially there are 2 types of knitting. One is called flat knitting, which is what we're going to be doing today, and one is called circular knitting. Flat knitting is exactly how it sounds, you're just knitting a flat piece of knitted fabric. Whereas in circular knitting, you're knitting tube shapes instead. And that's something you get onto as you advance. Beginners never really start with circular knitting, that's more of an advanced lesson for the future. The concept of flat knitting is that you're knitting back and forth along the row of stitches. So as you can see on this needle right now, we have a row of stitches. And we're going to knit from the top of the row to the bottom, and then from the bottom to the top. And we're going to keep doing that, knitting back and forth along the row all the way through the project. Because we're doing all knit stitches, we're going to be producing something called garter stitch. Garter stitch is just a name given to the type of knitting produced by just knit stitches, and it's recognisable by its wavy texture. Apart from the fact that garter stitch is simple to make, it's also reversible, which means that it looks the same on the front as it does on the back, which makes it perfect for scarves. I'm going to be throwing something called a slip stitch into this knitting project as well, in order to make the edges nice and smooth. It's a very simple stitch, and it just stops the edges from being a bit bumpy. However, if you prefer not to do the slip stitch edges, then simply replace each slip stitch with just a regular knit stitch instead. Okay, so to start with, you'll notice you've got all your stitches on your needle. And each stitch consists of yarn going all the way around the needle, and then on one side there's like a little knot. Each of the stitches should have one of these little knots, and to start with, they all should be pointing to the right. And the working yarn, which is the yarn connected to the ball of yarn, should be leaving the needle to the right. Throughout the knitting process, you want to have the stitches pushed up towards the top of the needle, but not so far up that they start to fall off by accident. You'll be holding one needle with your left hand and one needle with your right hand. This can feel kind of awkward and uncomfortable to start with, and you don't really know how to hold the needles, but just try and imitate me. The good thing about doing a project like this is that you're basically doing the same stitches over and over again, so it's the ultimate practice basically, and by the end you'll feel very comfortable with the needles, and knit stitches will come as second nature. So let's now learn how to knit. Basically all of the rows are just going to be knit stitches, apart from the very first stitch on each row, which will be a slip stitch. So therefore the first stitch is going to be a slip stitch. Now these slip stitches are going to be slipped purl-wise. purlwise refers to the direction that the needle is going to enter the stitch. Okay, so to do the very simple, I promise, slip stitch, you take your right hand needle point and you go down into the top stitch on the left hand needle. And you want the right hand needle to stay in front of the left hand needle. Once it's gone through the stitch, you can then angle it upwards. You then slide the right hand needle against the left hand needle towards the point to drag that stitch off the needle. So you're basically just transferring that top stitch from the left hand needle to the right. And that is a slip stitch. We're then going to do knit stitches for the rest of the row. But first, we just need to make sure that the working yarn is where we want it to be. So use your right hand to take the working yarn between the needles towards the back. Once the yarn is at the back, you can use your right hand to hold it loosely against the right hand needle. You nearly always have to have the yarn at the back of the needles away from you to do a knit stitch. The first action that you do in a knit stitch is pretty much the reverse of what you just did for a slip stitch. So you bring the right hand needle point, this time up through the top stitch, and then towards the back of the left hand needle. So up through that stitch and cross at the back of the left hand needle. At this point you can use your left hand to hold the needles in place. This frees your right hand to do the next step. So holding the working yarn in your right hand, you bring it around the back of the right hand needle point. And then round that point, and then between the two needle points. And then you hold that yarn next to the right hand needle again. So you're basically just wrapping that yarn around the right hand needle point. For the next step, you use your left hand. So making sure that the yarn is held against the right hand needle quite tightly, you take your left hand index finger and push on the point of the right hand needle. The idea is to slide that right hand needle point all the way around the left hand needle to the front, and the needles have to keep in contact at all times. Once you've got to this position, you simply slide that stitch off the top of the left hand needle by pushing it off with the right hand needle. And you've now done one knit stitch. This all does need a bit of coordination, but practice does make perfect. And now we're on to the next one. So, keeping the working yarn against the right hand needle, you take the right hand needle point up through the top stitch on the left needle, and you cross it behind. You then hold the needles with your left hand and bring the working yarn with your right hand around the back, and then wrap it around the right hand needle point, and then hold it taut against the right hand needle. You then slide the right hand needle point from the back all the way around to the front of the left hand needle. Because the needles stay in contact, that drags the stitch from the back to the front, making it ready to then be pushed off the top of the left hand needle. And that completes another stitch. And then we're on to the next knit stitch. So you take your right hand needle up through the top stitch and cross at the back. Wrap the working yarn around the needle point at the back and hold against the right hand needle. Bring the right hand needle to the front and then push the stitch off the top of the needle. I'm going to continue the demonstration until the end of this row so you can get used to seeing what the knit stitches look like and hopefully knit along with me. This particular row is row 1, and the next row will of course be row 2, and so on. we're going to be doing slightly different slip stitches at the beginning of the odd numbered rows compared to the beginning of the even numbered rows. So it's important to keep a tally of where you are, as in, are you doing an odd numbered row or are you doing an even numbered row? And in the next lesson, I'm going to be telling you a tip how you can tell at any point whether you're on an even or odd numbered row. And that will really help you if you get lost and you don't know what kind of slip stitch you're supposed to be doing. Okay, so once you've finished the last knit stitch on that row, you're going to swap the needles between your hands. And then we're going to do almost exactly the same for the next row. As I just mentioned, the slip stitch is slightly different at the beginning of an even numbered row compared to an odd numbered row. On the last row, i.e. row number 1, we slipped the stitch purlwise with the yarn at the front of the needles. Whereas on even numbered rows, i.e. row 2, which is this one, we'll slip the stitch purlwise but with the yarn at the back of the needles. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to slip the stitch purlwise with the yarn at the back. Make sure the working yarn is at the back of the needles away from you for this stitch. Then take the right hand needle point down through the top stitch as we did at the start of the previous row, making sure the right hand needle stays in front of the left. Then push that stitch off the top of the left hand needle. And that completes a slip stitch. And then we do knit stitches for the rest of the row. Please note that at this point we don't take the yarn from the front of the needles to the back like we did in the previous row, because the yarn is already supposed to be at the back. So that's where it stays throughout this entire row and throughout the knitting of every even numbered row. So we knit all the way to the end of this second row, and then once again switch the needles between our hands. And then the third row is exactly like the first. So we just repeat those first 2 rows over and over again until we have the length of scarf that we want. So just the same as row number 1, we make sure that the working yarn is towards the front of the needles, or at least hanging down in the centre. We then slip a stitch purlwise with the yarn in front, so we bring the right hand needle down through that top stitch and cross at the front. Then slip that stitch off. We then take the working yarn from the front, over the top of the needles, between the points, to the back, and then do knit stitches for the rest of the row. And that's all there is to it really. We just repeat the pattern for the first 2 rows over and over, and stop when we have a scarf that's long enough. There aren't any real rules about how long the scarf can be, so it's all down to personal preference. Because the pattern for this scarf is slightly different between the odd numbered rows and the even numbered rows, i.e. it's not the same pattern on every row, it's important to know what row you're actually on. Well, I'm going to give you a tip now about how you can easily find out. So if you're about to knit a row and you can't remember whether it's odd or even numbered, then simply look at where the yarn tail leaves your work on the right hand side. So make sure the scarf is neatly spread out and not all tangled up or twisted, and look at where the yarn tail leaves. Here you can see the yarn tail is at the upper edge of the knitting, and that means you're just about to start an odd numbered row. If the yarn tail was leaving your knitting at the bottom edge, then you would just be about to do an even numbered row instead. And that's how you easily tell what row you are on. This next class is all about how to add something called lifelines. Now, lifelines are something you can add into your knitted work in order to prepare for making mistakes. As a beginner, the thing I was most worried about was making a mistake. And not only making a mistake, but then not being able to rectify it and basically destroying all my work. A lifeline is basically a piece of scrap yarn that you insert into your knitting, and if after adding the lifeline you make a mistake, you can then unravel your work back to the lifeline and carry on from there. So obviously if you put lifelines every 5 inches, the most knitting you're going to have to redo if you make a mistake is 5 inches. I personally would recommend putting a lifeline into your knitting about every 2 or 3 inches, because otherwise you'll be unravelling a lot of your work. To do this, you will need a piece of scrap yarn that's at least 2 times the width of your project. This yarn ideally would be a little bit thinner than the yarn you're currently knitting with. You will also need a tapestry or yarn needle, or at least any needle that has an eye big enough for the scrap yarn to go through. You'll also likely need a little bit of scrap thread. I'm just using a short section of cotton thread. The first thing you need to do is thread your scrap yarn through the needle. If it's not easy to do this, then a little trick that I do is to get a piece of scrap thread and fold it in half. You then pass the folded loop end of the thread through the eye of the needle. You hold the thread in the eye of the needle whilst you pass the scrap yarn into the loop of the thread, like so. You then pull on the ends of the thread, and it can take a bit of brute force, but that pulls the yarn through the eye of the needle. And that can be easier than trying to thread the yarn without any help. So you drag that needle to the end of the yarn, and then what you're going to do is feed that needle alongside your knitting needle. So you want it to go through all the loops of stitches that are on your needle. So make sure that you've finished a row, preferably an even numbered row. That way you'll know that if you go back to a lifeline, that the next row you have to knit is an odd numbered row. So that's exactly what I've done. I've made sure that I've finished at the end of an even numbered row. I then feed the yarn through all the stitches, keeping the needle right up against the knitting needle. Once I've done that, I make sure there is enough excess yarn at either side of the row so that the yarn won't fall out. I also tie a knot in the scrap yarn at the bottom end of the row of stitches. This reminds me which side of the row the knitting needle will need to be fed into. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to knit a few rows to show you how that looks in the knitting. Okay, so I'm onto an odd numbered row. So I slip a stitch purlwise with the yarn at the front, move the yarn to the back over the top of the needles, and then knit the rest of the row, and so on for a few rows. You can see here the lifeline that's now embedded in your knitting. Okay, so how does this lifeline work? Well, if for instance I make a mistake and I want to unravel the work, then I can now unravel the work back to where the lifeline is. And the lifeline makes it really easy to just put the needle back into your work at that point. So what you do is you take your needle out of the stitches when you've made the mistake and you want to go back to the lifeline. You then unravel the yarn and you keep pulling on the working yarn until you get back to where the lifeline is. And then you won't be able to unravel any more stitches. At that point, you look at where the knot is on the scrap piece of yarn. And it's from this side that the knitting needle needs to be fed into the stitches. So you take the knitting needle and feed it into the stitches following the path of that lifeline. The lifeline indicates which stitches to go through and in which direction. So you just follow the lifeline all the way through the stitches. At this point, you can choose to pull the lifeline out of the row, but I would suggest keeping it in because you never know if you might need it again. And so you carry on knitting, and the next row will be an odd numbered row. So if you're worried about making mistakes at all, then putting lifelines at regular intervals throughout your work really helps to stop you worrying. So I hope that tip is useful for you. It could be that you want to add in a stripe if you're feeling adventurous, or more likely you want to change to a new ball of yarn when the old ball of yarn runs out. So how do you do this? Well, I make sure that I end at the end of a row, not midway through a row, but at the end. I also try and finish at the end of an even numbered row, just to make things simpler and also make sure that any yarn tails are on the same side of the knitting. So I've just finished an even numbered row, and I have approximately 6 inches, maybe 8 inches of yarn left. I would say 8 to 12 inches is how much yarn tail you need to leave. So measure that much out and then cut the working yarn. You then take the end of the new ball of yarn and make it into a loop, like so, with the tail end at the back and the working yarn end at the front. You want the tail end of this piece of yarn to again be about 8 inches long, at least. You then begin to knit the next row as usual. Because it's a slip stitch, we can't add in the new yarn for this stitch. If it was a knit stitch or similar, we could add the yarn in, but because we're just slipping the stitch and not actually knitting it at all, we can't add in the new yarn on the first stitch. So simply slip that stitch as usual, and because it's an odd numbered row, the yarn is at the front. I then take the yarn to the back between the needle points, and then go into my first knit stitch of the row. So I take the right hand needle up through the top stitch and cross behind. Now at this point, you don't use your current working yarn. Instead, you're going to go on to using the new ball of yarn. So you pick up the loop that you've made, making sure to keep the tail end at the back. You then hook that loop over the right hand needle tip, and then hold that yarn against the right hand needle as you complete the knit stitch. It's quite loose at the moment, so try and keep hold of both the working yarn and the tail of yarn. And that connects the new ball of yarn into your knitting. And then we go into the next knitting stitch. So we take the right hand needle up through the stitch and cross. And at this point you drop the new yarn tail. So you leave the yarn tail behind and just take the new working yarn to wrap around the right hand needle point. And then complete the knit stitch like usual. And then you simply keep knitting using the new working yarn. At this point you can pull on the new yarn tail and the working yarn just to tighten up the stitches a little bit. Okay, so I'll just show you what that looks like a few rows along. And you can see that there are a couple of yarn tails leaving your knitting, which we will weave in later. But apart from that, it's a very seamless join. And that's how you join a new ball of yarn. As you can see, I've now knit a lot more stitches and have a scarf that's as long as I want it to be. A good guideline to use if you're not sure how long to make your scarf, just make it as long as you are tall. That's the advice that I used. So to bind off, I'm going to use the standard knitting bind off technique, which is the most common method. The basic idea is to decrease the number of stitches on your needles one by one until they are all removed. This gives you the neat finished edge on the end of your scarf. The first stage of binding off is to do 2 knit stitches. So this should be easy enough since you've done many hundreds of knit stitches now. And once you've done that, you take your left hand needle, pick up the first knit stitch that you made and lift it over the second knit stitch that you made and off the end of the needle. You can use your thumbnail to make sure that that left hand knit stitch stays on your needle. And that results in you having just 1 knit stitch left on the right hand needle. You then do 1 more knit stitch. And you repeat the process again by using your left hand needle to pick up the knit stitch on the right hand side, lift it over the knit stitch on the left hand side and off the needle. And now you've reduced the number of stitches by 2. And you keep repeating those 2 steps. So you now knit a stitch, and then you pass the first stitch over the second and off the needle. And knit a stitch, and pass the knit stitch over the other. In knitting terms, this is often abbreviated to PSO, standing for Pass Stitch Over. So you do a K, which is a knit stitch, and then a PSO, which is where you pass a stitch over. And you repeat that until you have just 1 stitch remaining. You then cut the working yarn to leave you with at least 8 inches of yarn tail. Then remove the last stitch from the needle, making it a bit larger in the process. You want to be able to easily feed the yarn tail through the loop. You then simply tighten the yarn to secure the knitting. And that's it. That's how you bind off a knitting project. You will be weaving these yarn tail ends into your knitting during the next lesson. Now, weaving in is often a bit of a bugbear for knitters, and for some knitting projects there can be a lot of yarn tails to weave in at the end of a project. But honestly, it's nothing to worry about. As soon as you've done it once, you'll feel a lot calmer and more confident about the process. There are 2 options with weaving in yarn tails. You can either do it as you go along, or you can leave all of the yarn tails to weave in at the end of your project when you've finished. In this scarf in particular, I've used 2 separate balls of yarn, and so all I have is 4 yarn tails to weave in. I would suggest leaving the weaving in until after you've finished. On the other hand, if you're using lots of different colours, therefore lots of different balls of yarn, it might be better to weave some of the yarn tails in as you go along, so that you don't get to the end of your project and then have a lot of weaving in to do. This scarf is knitted in garter stitch, so if you look closely there's a kind of wavy pattern formed by the stitches. If you look a bit closer still, you'll see that these waves are created by the tops and the bottoms of loops. The tops of the yarn loops are shaped like rainbows, and I'll refer to them as N-shaped. And the bottom of yarn loops are shaped like U's, so I'm going to call them U-shaped. All weaving in tails is taking the yarn tail under the N shapes and under the U shapes in order to secure the yarn tail in place and also to make it blend in to your knitted work. After all, you don't want it to be obvious that you've woven in a yarn tail on your knitting. And that's the difficult bit really. The securing of the yarn tail is quite easy, but it's making it blend in to the pattern of the stitches, which is what makes it a little bit more complicated, but still it's very easy to do. So the first step is to feed the yarn tail into a yarn needle. I'm going to use the thread trick that I used in the Lifelines lesson, and then you're ready to feed that yarn tail into your knitting. It's quite difficult to show this technique clearly on video, especially because I'm using all one colour of yarn. So I'm going to just show you a diagram now to illustrate what we're going to do, and then I'm going to show it in real life. So here is a diagram showing the path that your yarn tail is going to take through the knitting. The idea is that you follow a path already laid down by yarn in your knitting. So you're just going to follow the looping path of yarn that's already been knit. So if you look at the diagram, there are N shapes and U shapes, which represents how garter stitch looks. You will first find an N shape that's very close to where the yarn tail leaves the knitted work. You then take your yarn needle up and under the yarn that's labelled A. Then you go up and under the U shape labelled B, down under the U shape labelled C, and then back through the N shape labelled A again, and that completes a full loop. And then you repeat that by first moving along to an adjacent N shape, this time labelled D. And you repeat the same steps again, so you go up through D, up through E, down under F, down through D, and that's another loop. And you keep going along the loops in the same direction for at least 5 loops, just to make sure that it's nice and secure. You then cut off the excess yarn, and you've woven in your yarn tail. I'm now going to show you the process in real life using red thread for the demo. So you would first find the N shape that's very close to where the yarn tail leaves your knitting. And then you'll go up and under that N, up and under the U that's just a bit up and to the left, and then go down through the adjacent U shape, and then back down under the N shape you first went through. And then you move along to the adjacent N shape and repeat the whole process. So you go up through the N, a bit upwards and to the left under that U that you've already been through, and then down through the adjacent U shape, and back through the N shape you've already been through as well. And so on and so forth, until you've completed at least 4 or 5 loops. And here I am just doing it for real on the scarf, but because I'm using blue yarn on blue yarn, it's very difficult to tell on the camera. So I had to be a bit more creative to show you the process. I'm going to be showing you how to add tassels to both of the finished edges of the scarf. This step is of course optional, but I think it gives a really nice finish. For this step you will of course need yarn, some scissors, as well as a yarn needle and a short piece of strong thread. In hindsight, I maybe should have used a different colour for the tassels, or just planned the colour scheme a bit better, because what I thought was I could have done a cream scarf with either hot pink tassels or rainbow coloured tassels and made it just look a bit more interesting. So that's just something to think about. These tassels can be made in all different colours, so it's chance to add a bit of personality and a bit of fun to your scarf if you wish. The other thing you will need is some kind of container or even a bit of scrap cardboard. I'm just using a plastic takeaway box for this, but you want something that's basically as wide as you want the tassels long. I'm going to be wrapping the yarn around this container in order to make the strands of yarn for the tassels. I wouldn't worry too much about this, because you can always cut the tassels shorter later on. The first thing I'm going to do is take the ball of yarn and then tie the yarn around the container with a knot, as demonstrated here. I'm then going to continue wrapping the yarn around and around and around this container. Once I feel like I've wrapped enough yarn around the container, which in my case means 6 wraps per tassel that I want to make, then I stop. I then take my scissors and cut through the yarn pieces all along one side of the container. I also make sure to remove the knot. This should give you a load of yarn strands that are about the same length. The next thing I do is line up 6 yarn strands. That's how many yarn strands I want to be in my tassel, but of course if you want them to be chunkier, then you can put more yarn into each tassel. Don't worry if all of the yarn strands aren't exactly the same length. You can always cut them to an equal size now or later on. Once I've lined up those yarn strands, I take the short piece of strong thread and lie it down underneath the strands, so it lies in the middle. I then bring up the ends of that thread and feed them through the yarn needle. You will see that I'm using a chunky plastic yarn needle for this, and I do find it a lot easier to use this than a pointed metal needle. The reason for this is that a large plastic needle is less likely to split the yarn. Then all you need to do is decide where you want to place the tassels on the edge of your scarf. Decide how many tassels you want and how far apart you want them to be. I'm going to put my first one on the edge of the scarf. I don't want to put it right on the very end row of the scarf because I want it to be strong and secure, and it's more secure if the tassel is tied around 2 rows rather than just 1. So instead of taking the needle through the first row of garter stitch, I'm going to take it through the second row. So that's the second row of garter stitch from the edge. The direction you want to take the needle through the scarf is from the front of the scarf to the back. If you haven't chosen which side of the scarf is the front and which side is the back, then I would suggest that the back is where you've woven in the yarn tail ends. So you take the needle from the front of the scarf to the back, and I try and go through the scarf underneath an N-shaped stitch. So that's the top of a loop. Once you've pulled the tassel through the scarf, you want to remove the thread and the needle. Then you want to take your finger and thumb through the loop, grab onto the yarn tail ends, and pull them through the loop. Make sure the tassel is straight and tighten that knot. And now you've made your first tassel. And now it's time for the second tassel. So again, I lay out 6 strands of yarn, put the piece of thread in the middle underneath, and then feed the ends of that thread through the yarn needle. If we just take a look at the tassel, you can see that the smooth side is at the front and the back of the tassel knot is split down the middle, which is why we feed the needle through the front of the scarf. Okay, so at this point I decided that I wanted the tassels 4 stitches apart. So I counted the N shapes from the last tassel. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 N shapes. And I'm going to put my needle into the front of the scarf just under that 4th N. So I take the needle from front to back, remove the needle and the thread, put my finger and thumb through the loop and pull the yarn tails through. And now I have 2 tassels. And you simply carry on like that all the way along the scarf edge, making sure to space the tassels evenly. And then you do exactly the same on the other end of the scarf. And that's all there is to it. I really hope you've enjoyed learning how to knit, and now hopefully you have a cosy scarf to keep you warm. I want to thank you very much for taking my class, and I hope you've had fun.